The following video is an in-depth review of Pikmin for the Nintendo GameCube. Extended lengths of gameplay footage will be shown, so if you haven't already played the game for yourself, it would be advisable to do so before watching this video. However, for the sake of those who haven't played the game but want to watch anyways, I'll provide basic information about the game's mechanics before looking at them in greater detail. Pikmin was released in 2001 as a launch title for the Nintendo GameCube. It was the first release of the Pikmin franchise, with Pikmin 2 being released in 2004 for GameCube, and Pikmin 3 in 2013 for the Wii U. In 2009, Pikmin was re-released for Wii. The re-release featured new play controls, allowing players to use the Wii Remote and Nunchuck instead of the GameCube controller. Although some would consider the re-release to be the definitive version of the game, this video will solely focus on the initial release for GameCube. In the opening cinematic, we see Captain Olimar cruising along in the SS Dolphin in space when a sudden collision with an asteroid forces him to make a crash landing on an unexplored planet. Following the impact, Captain Olimar remarks that about 30 pieces of his ship must have broken off of the SS Dolphin during the crash landing, and made an impact on the planet's surface in various locations. Olimar also notes that the planet's atmosphere mainly consists of poisonous oxygen, and that the life support system in his suit will only last for about 30 in-game days. After Olimar discovers the planet's Pikmin, multicolored plant-like life forms that peculiarly obey him, he accepts them as his best hope for recovering the ship parts within 30 days so he can safely return home. The game uses Olimar's note-taking mechanism as its main method of delivering important information to the player. Whenever Olimar notices something new or interesting about his environment, a dialog box pops up and Olimar's notes type across the screen with a systematic ticking sound effect for every keystroke. I like the way they implemented this method of informing the player. It's consistent with the circumstances of the plot, so whenever these little sequences occur, even if Olimar is just giving you instructions on how to play the game, the keystroke sounds do a decent job of characterizing Olimar as some sort of trained space explorer, who diligently takes detailed scientific notes on his surroundings and discoveries. It's a small touch, but its implementation does feel very natural in the context of the game, and it makes for a relatively smooth, inoffensive, and non-insulting tutorial sequence. For the most part, the tone of Olimar's notes is very cut and dry and pragmatic. However, some of the stuff he writes upon finding certain ship parts later in the game suggests that he's a bit gullible, and perhaps even a bit in over his head with the crisis he's in. These moments in the game are silly, but it could also be said that these showcases of Olimar's obliviousness at times can contribute to the impending mood of anxiety that looms over the player as the final day of life support approaches, and the chances of survival start to wane. Also towards the end of the game, we see some more emotionally charged end-of-day journal entries from Olimar, as he starts feeling more homesick and yearns to see his family again. This is good. It helps the player want what Olimar wants in the same way that he does, if only by adding a little bit of variety to the journal entries which, ordinarily, are just reflective accounts of his daytime discoveries. I'm going to take some time to talk about the actual Pikmin now. I'll start out with some basic information about their mechanics before I examine their design in greater detail. You have 3 different types of Pikmin discovered in 3 different areas of the game. Red Pikmin are encountered at the impact site, yellow Pikmin are encountered soon after in the Forest of Hope, and blue Pikmin are encountered in the Forest Navel. Red Pikmin have noses and are immune to fire hazards. After battling a variety of enemies with different types of Pikmin, it becomes noticeable that red Pikmin do a little bit more base damage to enemies than the other types. Considering how red Pikmin's pointy nose could puncture enemies while battling, this actually makes a little bit of sense in an implicit sort of way. Yellow Pikmin have huge elf-like ears and can carry bomb rocks, which are necessary to destroy stone barriers. They also fly highest when thrown, and I think it's safe to assume this is the case because their ears probably catch some of the air while they're being thrown, resulting in a gliding effect, so to speak. That and Olimar explicitly states that he suspects yellow Pikmin are lighter than the others upon discovering them. Blue Pikmin have mouth-shaped gills and can survive in the water where other Pikmin drown. Pikmin reproduce by carrying pellet posies and carcasses of enemies back to their onions, where they're sucked up through the tractor beam and converted into a quantity of Pikmin sprouts directly related to the size or lethality of the enemy. These sprouts can either be plucked a few seconds after the onion plants them, or they can sit in the ground and bloom into upgraded bud and flowered Pikmin which walk faster, are more durable, deal more base damage to enemies, and accomplish tasks such as bridge building and barrier leveling much faster than leaf Pikmin. Flowered Pikmin can also be obtained by finding consumable nectar in the in-game environments. If Pikmin of mixed colors are carrying a non-spaceship part object back to the landing site, the object will arrive at the onion matching the color of the majority. So if 4 Pikmin are carrying, say, a dwarf red Bulborb back to the launch site, 1 red, 1 yellow, and 2 blue, the Bulborb will arrive at the blue onion, and more blue Pikmin sprouts will be made, which makes plenty of sense, and is a necessary property of the Pikmin for the game to even be playable at all. When you're controlling a squad of Pikmin, you press A to throw them wherever the cursor is, press X to dismiss them into an idle state, and use the C-stick to manually reposition your squad in the direction the C-stick is pointing. That's the basics of Pikmin. Now, I'm going to get into a little discussion about the Pikmin's design choices. I'm probably going to be curious about what other people think about the topics I'm fixing to cover, so please comment on the video after you've finished watching it if you have an opinion you'd like to share. Whenever Pikmin die, a little Pikmin-shaped spirit will ascend out of the spot where the Pikmin died, accompanied by a whimpering Pikmin sound. I love this because it makes it very hard for the Pikmin to feel like expendable foot soldiers. It feels bad to see even 1 Pikmin spirit after a battle, and it feels extremely bad to see 50 spirits ascend after an enemy steamrolls over your entire army, or accidentally detonating a bomb rock on your squad because you were careless. Thankfully, you can always revert to where you last saved if catastrophe occurs. But despite only having to replay the last 15 minutes of gameplay at most, the penalty for Pikmin massacres still feels very punishing and very real whenever it happens to you. Pikmin will frequently get stuck on objects in the map, sometimes for no reason. Sometimes this is just a consequence of impatience with slower moving leaf Pikmin. If you run too far ahead of your squad, they won't be able to catch up and this could put them in danger. But other times, it'll happen just because of how unnecessarily awkward it can be to control the Pikmin with the C-stick. Crossing bridges with squads larger than 30 or 40 is especially awkward because of how much you need to mess with the C-stick to condense larger size squads down into more manageable little blobs to avoid having them fly off all over the sides of the bridge. This technique does work, but it still feels pretty unnatural to have to do it this way. Pikmin trip and will sometimes do things on their own. This is probably the most controversial aspect of the way the Pikmin were designed. While traveling with a squad of Pikmin, sometimes a couple of them will randomly trip, and take a couple seconds to get up and catch up with the rest of the pack. Whenever Pikmin edge close to a patch of grass, they'll dismiss themselves from the rest of the squad and start searching for nectar, so they'll have to be whistled back into control. Whenever specific enemies like the iridescent flint beetle come close to your squad, they'll start attacking it without being told to. This tendency of Pikmin to get distracted by certain environment triggers, as well as their tendency to occasionally trip and fall down, are deliberate design flaws that were implemented to ensure that Pikmin don't simply feel like lifeless drones for Olimar to use as weapons and tools. Task-oriented players that tend to focus on completing in-game objectives as efficiently as possible will often cite this as a bad thing, but I think it's worth considering that this game is very aware of this type of mentality. Having Pikmin occasionally do things of their own volition challenges and stifles this mentality more than other games, especially games with RTS elements ordinarily would, in an effort to make the game feel like a more immersive and authentic experience. In some cases this works very well, but in others it generates unnecessary problems. The best way I see this working is with the way the Pikmin madly attack the iridescent flint beetle in the impact site. The beetle appears far from any real threats to the Pikmin's safety, so it feels okay to engage and indulge in the frantic nature of the situation. Frantically tossing Pikmin in an attempt to land one on the beetle's back to reap some small rewards creates a lot of hilarious on-screen chaos. But in this scenario, pursuing the beetle and initiating chaos is left entirely up to the player. Uninterested players can pass by and do what they need to do without having their progress being sorely inhibited. All they have to do is whistle back the Pikmin that become distracted if they veer too close to the battle. I'm not entirely sure of how I feel about Pikmin dismissing themselves from the squad to go uproot blades of grass in search of nectar. Nectar is a very useful thing for the player to find. It upgrades ordinary leaf Pikmin into the superior flower Pikmin that I described earlier. On one hand, this can be considered a good thing for the game's atmosphere. The fact that Pikmin uproot blades of grass to find nectar as if they were acting on instinct characterizes them akin to wild animals that aren't yet well understood by Olimar or his people. Despite following almost every command that Olimar gives them, The Pikmin are still perceptive of their environment in ways that Olimar, and by extension the player, isn't. At first sight, the nectar-yielding blades of grass don't visually stand out from the rest of the environment. That's not to say they're particularly difficult for the player to find or investigate using the Pikmin, though. It's just that they don't look out of the ordinary at all unless you've seen them before in previous areas of the game. I think it's safe to say that if the Pikmin didn't act on instinct, dismiss themselves from the squad, and uproot blades of grass, some players may not have been able to discover the valuable way to obtain flowered Pikmin until slightly later areas in the game, like in the forest navel, which has crystallized nectar on the ground from which you can also obtain liquid nectar, which is far more visually obvious than the little blades of grass containing nectar that can be found as early as Day 2 in the landing site of the Forest of Hope. From this, I think it's fair to say that even though Pikmin getting distracted by blades of grass can be very annoying during later stages of the game, I think this design choice is good for the game on the whole, especially in terms of the game's atmosphere and how Olimar and the player perceive the Pikmin. The Pikmin's distractibility makes contextual sense. The trait serves to showcase what their survival instincts were before Olimar arrived and took control, and it just wouldn't make very much sense for Olimar to take absolute precedence over those instincts. In this case, the trade-off works in the game's favor. Where it doesn't work in the game's favor is when the Pikmin don't pick up pellet posies after they're finished destroying the stalk. This is definitely a negative thing. If you run through stalks of pellet posies, the Pikmin will become distracted and start attacking them until they're destroyed and the pellet is on the ground. But they won't carry it back to the onion. They'll just run back into the squad under Olimar's control. If the Pikmin actually tried to carry the pellets back to the launch site to reproduce, this would be fine and it would even make sense, because the Pikmin depend on the pellets to reproduce and survive. Even if you deliberately throw a Pikmin at a pellet posy, it'll just stand there after it's finished destroying the stalk, and you'll have to throw more Pikmin at the pellet to get them to carry it. The Pikmin's inability to act on this independently is irritating, especially considering that the game's RTS elements should reward players for playing efficiently, instead of demanding extra effort for such a basic action. It's easy to forget about the properties of yellow Pikmin. Yellow Pikmin's bomb rock carrying ability makes them stand out from the other two Pikmin types, and here's why. If dismissed with X, yellow Pikmin will hold on to their bombs after being called. If thrown, yellow Pikmin will drop their bombs after being called. You have to run directly into them to make sure they keep carrying the bombs, and this can be cumbersome and sometimes easy to forget about. Considering how easy it is to understand the properties of the red and blue Pikmin, handling yellow Pikmin feels substantially more difficult in comparison. This isn't a huge issue, but a part of me still feels like the Pikmin's properties could have been more tightly designed in such a way that the yellow Pikmin don't stick out so much as the most volatile Pikmin type. Then again, you could also see this as a good thing, because it gives the player the power to take more risky but potentially effective approaches to combat scenarios, particularly with the final boss, Emperor Bulblax. Because yellow Pikmin drop their bombs when they're called back after being thrown, this makes it possible to throw a bunch of bomb-carrying yellow Pikmin at a spot where the Emperor Bulblax is going to be, call them back, and deal massive damage and prolonged hit stun on Emperor Bulblax, making the fight almost laughably short for players skilled enough to execute the maneuver. When you look at it like that, the fact that yellow Pikmin have this property adds to the game's replay value, because it rewards players for optimizing strategies according to their knowledge of the game, and I think this is one of Pikmin's best qualities. Despite the fact that Pikmin makes it very easy for the player to understand the roles and functions of the tools he's been given, the game can be broken down and played to an extremely high level of efficiency, without extensive meta-knowledge of the game that takes time to research and comprehend. All of the information that's necessary to know how to play the game super efficiently is made readily apparent to even remotely observant players. I want to cover the game's enemies a little more now. A lot of the game's enemies have traits or roles akin to animals on Earth, and a lot of thought was put into their appearance. Wollywogs obviously resemble frogs. They attack by leaping and squashing Pikmin beneath them. They like to hang out near bodies of water, and they even ribbit. The coolest part about them is how the game subtly suggests to the player that different species of them exist, and that there are environmental factors that support why they appear the way they do in different areas. In the dimly lit forest navel, Wollywogs have pale exteriors because of a lack of exposure to light, but Wollywogs in the distant spring have bright yellow exteriors because they get a lot of more exposure to the sun there. Fans of the Pikmin franchise are probably well aware that in Pikmin 2, Olimar makes note of this difference in the Piklopedia, but I digress. This is a thoughtful little touch. The fact that it's more implicitly suggested than explicitly noted by Olimar, interrupting the gameplay, makes it that much better. The game's enemies are pretty diverse. They range in size and lethality, from the very non-threatening burrowing sheer grubs to the towering and formidable beady longlegs or emperor bullblacks. The game isn't too explicit about which enemies are and aren't bosses. If an enemy is particularly formidable or boss-like, it'll usually be sequestered off in a little arena, usually guarded by barriers or other enemies. I guess you could classify bosses as enemies that change the game music while you're battling them, in which case only the beady longlegs and emperor bullblacks would qualify as bosses. There are other enemies that could qualify as bosses in the game though, like the 2 armored cannon beetles in the Forest of Hope and the Distant Spring, the Puffstool, the burrowing Snagret, as well as some optional bosses, the Smoky Prog, the Mamuda, and the Gulix. My favorite enemy in the game would probably have to be the Breadbug, because of the hilarious strategy involved in killing it, where you have to get 2 or more Pikmin to tug of war it, dragging it to the launch site where an onion's tractor beam sucks up whatever item it's in his mouth, taking the Breadbug along with it and delivering a fatal bonk to its head. I'm really glad that a spaceship part was hidden inside the Breadbug, because seeing that happen was a highlight of the game for me. Another favorite enemy of mine was the Puffstool in the Forest Navel. If you bother it enough, it'll emit purple spores that infect your Pikmin and turn them into purple mushroom zombie Pikmin that start attacking Olimar and the other normal Pikmin in the squad, which is pretty terrifying, especially during the first playthrough of the game. After Olimar wakes up at the impact site of the unknown planet, it quickly becomes clear that the game takes place on a slightly altered version of Earth. The flora, aside from the pellet posies, in the game's terrain is all familiar Earth plants, but the fauna consists of bizarre fictional animals, some of them bearing closer resemblance to Earth-like animals than others. Although the world feels mostly familiar to the player, there's a strange offness about it that I find difficult to put into words. So instead, I'll just list some of the elements that come together to help create the game's strange atmosphere. In the Forest of Hope, you can see leaf shadows on the ground, and you can see the shadows sway a little bit as the trees catch wind. This adds a very nice sense of scale to the world, reminding the player that Olimar and the Pikmin are only a couple centimeters tall. The old-looking tin cans containing explosive bombs suggest that humans either exist on the unknown planet, or existed in some point in time. There isn't any other apparent reason for the tin cans to be scattered around the planet, and Olimar never acknowledges their existence at all. The background music is excellent. It has no small part in establishing the game's atmosphere. The Forest of Hope's background music is definitely my favorite. I think it fits the mood of the game better than any of the other background music tracks. For me, it evokes sensations of curiosity, spaciousness, wonder, yearning, and, dare I say it, hope, and a little bit of melancholy as well. The percussive elements help to make the environment scenery feel unexplored and exotic, but not intimidating or dissuasive. The guitar in the background of the Forest Navel also plays along to this effect similarly, but the twanginess of the guitar pitches the mood to a wily, more untamed end of the spectrum, if that makes sense. It almost sounds westerny. The Distant Spring contrasts most with the Forest of Hope while still retaining the elements that make the environment feel unexplored. While the Forest of Hope's music sounds more warm and welcoming, the Distant Spring's ambient music sounds especially vast and ethereal, almost desolate. Battling enemies in the distant spring dynamically shifts the music to sound very otherworldly and estranged. The only music in the game that I think doesn't fit particularly well is the music in the background of the final trial. It falls too far between trying to sound frantic and quirky at the same time, when they could have just focused on capturing one of those moods and it probably would have ended up sounding better. The impact site music just sounds more quirky and unorthodox than anything, and it fits just fine in beginning the game with an initially curious type of mood. A quirky background track in the game's final area to reflect the quirky music in the game's very first area probably would have sounded equally cool as a purely pensive sounding background track without many deliberately odd elements thrown in there to boost the quirk factor. I'm not going to bother discussing the game's graphics all too much. If you've been watching the video up to now, you've probably seen enough to know that the game looks pretty good. Nothing sticks out as being horrendously ugly to the point that it damages immersion. I'm no expert on the graphical evolution of water over time within video games, but I think the water looks pretty nice for a 2001 GameCube game. The small ponds in the Forest of Hope and the Forest Navel are clear blue, or sometimes even a little dark, but the water in the distant spring ranges from shades of purple to teal and green. It's cool looking water for sure. I can only think of one moment in the game where the terrain had me disoriented and unsure of my sense of direction, and that was in the Forest Navel, on some day after I had cleared out the sandy area's population of fiery blowhogs. The terrain was so homogeneous and the radius of my field of view was short enough that I became momentarily unsure of which direction I was headed, and I had to check the map to reorient myself. I would imagine that moments like this are probably only unique to players like me who are sometimes prone to losing their place in the map every once in a while anyways, so I think it would be unfair to say that this is a negative consequence of the game's bland environments or something like that. On the topic of in-game maps, I have some things to say about the game's map screen that can be accessed by pressing the Y button after recovering the Whimsical Radar spaceship part. First off, the Whimsical Radar is the only spaceship part in the game that possesses an in-game function aside from unlocking new areas after it's been recovered. This idea was further expanded upon in Pikmin 2 with treasures recovered from final floor bosses and caverns. But in Pikmin 1, recovering the Whimsical Radar allows you to access a map of whatever area you're in with spaceship parts indicated by little stars. Needless to say, this cuts down on the amount of blind exploration in the game by a whole lot. I don't like having the map very much because it eliminates a lot of the challenge of locating spaceship parts by exploring the map on your own. Granted, the decision to have the map give the player this much information was without a doubt made to dilute the stress of the 30-day time limit. On your first playthrough of the game, it would be kind of stressful to explore an area without any knowledge of the location of your parts, especially those in somewhat hard-to-reach areas or those arbitrarily hidden inside certain enemies, like the part hidden inside the puffy blowhog in the distant spring or the part hidden inside the bread bug in the Forest Navel. But again, it can be argued that the stress from the 30-day time limit is what makes Pikmin unique and engaging in the first place, and having the map just treads all over it. A fair compromise for the map would be that Olimar maps the terrain as the player explores it, so that way players aren't completely in the dark if they need help remembering how to navigate the map efficiently on their second visit to an area. This is exactly the type of system that was implemented in later installments. When the player first enters an area, nothing is visible on the map except what's in front of Olimar, but as the player explores the area, more and more portions of the map are filled in. Tailoring your composition of Pikmin colors to the tasks you want to be able to accomplish for the day feels really cool. This is one of the ways that Pikmin strategy elements shines best for me. Say that it's getting close to the end of the day, and you deposit all of your Pikmin back up into the onions where they safely lodge for the night. To kill time, you start running into unexplored areas of the map where ship parts are, and you see all the little obstacles and elemental hazards that your Pikmin will need to traverse or neutralize in order to carry the part back to the landing site safely. At this point, your mind is probably racing, trying to figure out the optimal composition of Pikmin colors to approach the tasks you've laid out for yourself to complete the next day. This is the point where Pikmin has me engaged the most, where, in my head, I'm eagerly planning and devising strategies for completing in-game tasks in efficient ways. It feels hard to put down the game at times like this. Each in-game day flows seamlessly from one 13-minute segment into the next. The high levels of engagement in the game's strategic aspects that Pikmin generates, combined with all the neat little details that implicitly suggest a bunch of cool ideas about the uncharted planet, gets you a very stimulating, replayable experience that manages to retain mass appeal despite being a console RTS game, a genre typically known for being jargon-heavy, somewhat inaccessible, and an abomination to play without keyboard and mouse controls. Aside from a couple of awkward maneuvers, Pikmin pulls off the console RTS control scheme pretty gracefully. After playing Pikmin for just the first few hours, it would have been safe to call me a fan of the game and a fan of the franchise. After playing through the game several times to put this review together, it would still be safe to say the same thing. This concludes my review on Pikmin. I hope you've enjoyed watching this review as much as I enjoyed making it. I'm probably going to make more reviews in the future, so subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more from me. I'd greatly appreciate feedback, so please rate and comment on the video. Thank you for watching, and once again, I hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it.